So this is an in-depth video on my new Frameworks trail bike that I designed. I'm just gonna go over all the details of the frame, the geometry, the kinematics, the construction, and a little bit of ride feedback after getting to ride it for a little while. I've always wanted to make a trail bike. I probably ride them more than I ride downhill bikes. As a downhill racer, we use them to train all the time, whether we're doing endurance rides, intervals, whatever it is. Especially where I live in Pisgah Forest, it's a bike I ride almost every day. So over the past couple years, I've had some of the best enduro bikes on the market. Took a bunch of notes. I had probably 6 different bikes at one point, and there was things I liked and didn't like about all of them. I was getting pretty nitpicky by the end, but some of them were really good, and I tried to take all those positives and just add a couple of small details of my own to make my version of the perfect trail bike. It's not perfect yet, but it's definitely a step in the right direction. So just to jump into the geometry, it's got a 480 reach. It's got a 455 mil chainstay. The bottom bracket is 340 millimeters off the ground. It's got mixed wheels, so 27 back, 29 front. Head angle is 64 degrees. I try to take everything I learned from the downhill bike after many iterations of refining that frame and hopefully jump right into a better starting point for making a trail bike. And I think I did. It's pretty darn good for the first try. It feels good, and construction-wise, it's close. So with that, we just copied the tubing and the way that we did the gussets on the downhill frame because we knew it would work. I didn't want to try to go for something super light and take too much risk in the first prototype. I just wanted a reliable bike, could ride, get a good baseline, and go from there. So just like the new downhill bike we built, the tubing is all a step up from what we were using last year. The down tube is 2" by 083 wall. The top tube is 1 3/4 by 083 wall. And the seat tube is 1.5" by 083 wall. The bike uses the same seat stay, the carbon seat stay, as I have on my downhill bike, and unfortunately, the carbon chainstay didn't fit. It was a goal of mine to use the same chainstay and seat stay on both the trail bike and the downhill bike, but I learned my lesson for thinking ahead. So going shorter on the chainstay and lower on the main pivot, basically my chainstay bridge, where it goes from chainstay up to main pivot, the angle of that and the bridge ended up running into the bottom bracket, so I just didn't have enough clearance. So in the future, I'm going to make a specific chainstay for this bike, and maybe even like a new one for the downhill bike that works for both. I think now having the frame, I could have made one that worked well for both, but not having designed this when I made the chainstay mold, I just tried to think of clearance for like cranks and things like that, but I didn't take into account like bringing the pivot down and moving it rear end forward. So $10,000 mistake. I guess that's me learning how to make bikes. That's my education. So we designed this frame in line with the new downhill frames we have and shared the same philosophy for construction. And one thing that we did was, instead of putting the rocker pivot through a boss through the seat tube, we put it in a gusset that connects the top tube and seat tube. And on Enduro frame, obviously you have to consider seat post insertion. You can't just run the pivot axle through the center of the seat tube. And we ended up doing the same thing on the downhill bike, and it actually helps a lot with construction. We can use a straight seat tube, no tubes need to be bent, and the gusset helps to strengthen the joint between the top tube and the seat tube. So it's kind of a win-win there. And a big thing on this bike for me was seat post insertion, so this allows us to get a ton of seat post insertion. Making fabrication easier was something that I wanted to do with our new frames, kind of getting into the nitty-gritty of manufacturing processes more so than ride quality later in the stage. We put a lot more complexity into the CNC parts on this bike instead of Frank's hands, who was building the bike. And that just allows it to be a little bit easier to build, and if it's easier to build, he can do a better job. So the entire bottom bracket, main pivot, shock mount to down tube piece, that kind of L bend, is all one piece, CNC'd, and that locks in all the points and allows him to use a straight down tube to connect to it, so no bent tube. it just makes the construction on his side a lot more simple than welding all those small pieces together. It uses the same head tube as our downhill bike. For a prototype, it's nice to just have an oversized ZS56 head tube that we can use angle sets or reach adjust. In the future, I think a trail bike would be better with a tapered steer tube. We were just trying to use the same parts that we had. The links on these bikes, we made a big improvement after learning how the downhill bike links worked. It gets a connection in front of the seat tube, so the thought was that the frame can still flex with no brace behind the seat tube, but the links can't move independently. We were bending some shock bolts, and with that connection, it just makes sure that the link is locked in. It's actually two CNC'd pieces that are keyed in and bolted together. We went for 30 mil hardware on the shock mount. That way we're running the bearings. Fox makes the bearings for the eyelet, so you can get the bearings in the front of the rocker link if you want to. You don't have to, you can also just use the 30 mil straight hardware. Because that front of the rocker link gets a fair amount of rotation, the bearings give the whole linkage a little bit smoother feel. One thing pretty unique to the design of these bikes is that I mounted the shock with a small shock extender to turn the shock on a 90 where it mounts the mainframe and put the piggyback sideways. What that does is allow me way more clearance at the down tube to mount the piggyback on the bottom and not have to have a huge down tube belly to clear the piggyback. A short shock extender actually doesn't really do too much to add stress to the shock. In fact, allowing it to move in 4 directions instead of 2, maybe even take some load off the shock like a spherical bearing would. We offset the entire shock to the non-drive side about 14 millimeters, and there's plenty of space inside the crank arm. In fact, the chain guide and the chainstay stick out further than the piggyback. That means you'll never touch it with your foot. I haven't had any issues in riding it so far. Definitely looks funny to start with, like I'm gonna hit my foot on that, but it's completely out of the way. Maybe it's even rapid cooling, being exposed a little bit more, so the piggyback gets a little bit more airflow and keeps your oil cooler. Jokes aside, the only downside I noticed was it's a little harder to reach your climb switch. I don't really use that anyway, and when it's muddy, your adjusters get a little bit of mud in them, but they do on other bikes as well. It's easy to clean out. Fits a water bottle pretty easily. All the cable routing is external. The seat stay takes a UDH or transmission SRAM mount. So the bike takes a 230 by 60 shock, which is pretty standard for a bike like this. So going into the kinematics, the bike as it sits is 160/160. The leverage ratio is 22% progressive. It starts just over 3-to-1 and goes down to about 2.35-to-1 at full travel. Anti-squat's pretty important on a trail bike. At sag, it's around 110%. It's just a balance between main pivot height for axle path and having too high of an anti-squat. Ideally, you'd want it 100% all the time, given whatever center of gravity you chose. I feel like this bike is a good balance, maybe even with the seat angle helping it. It doesn't bob very much when you're pedaling it, but you also get a rearward axle path in the beginning of the travel, and it doesn't really come too far forward. In fact, from sag to about 100 mil travel, it doesn't really grow or come forward much at all. That's kind of at the apex of the axle path. So it has a really consistent feel when cornering it. I think that definitely helps with the cornering feel. So the downhill bike is a lot higher main pivot, which gives it a lot higher anti-squat. A downhill bike, I believe, at least a race bike, you're only pedaling it if you're sprinting it. So having it stiffen under pedaling forces isn't a bad thing. The only downside is that it almost is always coupled with pedal kick. And with the downhill bike, we committed using the O-chain all the time. Whereas with the trail bike, I didn't want to design around an O-chain because it would be nice if the bike that's primarily your pedaling didn't require an O-chain for it to feel good. And with that, I did balance the main pivot between anti-squat and pedal kick with axle path. That's always kind of the balance you're in with a 4-bar bike. The braking, the anti-rise, is around 60%. I feel like that's a good spot to be in. It allows the bike to feel active under braking. It doesn't lock up bikes that are a lot higher to me feel like they get pretty rigid when you are on the brakes. So this one allows it to feel active without feeling too light on the rear end. If it was super low, like 20%, it can make the shock kind of extend and the bike ride high under braking, which makes the rear wheel feel like it doesn't have as much grip and downforce under braking. When you get over 100%, it really loads the shock and gives it that downforce, but because you're loading the spring, it makes the bike feel stiff under braking. So I feel like 60%, from my experience, is a good middle ground. And these calculations are almost always isolating the shock and the linkage system only. So considering that you're going to be loading the front wheel and your fork's going to be compressing, allowing the back wheel to be active without as much downforce isn't as much of a negative as when you look at it isolated as only the shock and the linkage. Seat post insertion on this bike is awesome. That's been one of my pet peeves of all the bikes that I've ridden. I wish, as a downhill rider, that I could get that seat as low and out of the way as possible. As you see, the bike sitting here is with a 200mm Fox dropper, and that thing could be even lower. This is the way that Asa raced it on Saturday. And I've even fit a 240 dropper in that I bought a couple years ago looking for a bike to put it on. And in the end, I had to design a bike to put it on because it didn't fit on any bikes that I could buy. So you could put this post or even a 240mm post, slam to the collar, and there's enough space for it to work with the actuator without hitting the main pivot. Designing a straight seat post from the main pivot up was a big consideration for me. Ideally, you'd go from the bottom bracket up, but the main pivot up gives me the seat post insertion I need, and I think is a good compromise. Obviously, the bike fits a water bottle pretty easily. The bike's pretty heavy. I kind of expected that using all the downhill tubing and even swapping over all the downhill parts onto it. We didn't by any means try to make a light bike, but it weighs 39 pounds with a coil shock, 17 kgs. I'd like to make it lighter in the future when you ride it all day. A couple of the days that I tested it, we were out all day pedaling, and it definitely just starts to feel heavy. I think if we can capture some of the same ride quality with a lighter bike, it would improve it. But all around, it works pretty damn good. This is the bike that Asa Vermette raced in the National Championship Enduro on Saturday. He ended up winning the race, which was awesome. I think it's more rider than bike, of course, but this bike definitely didn't hold him back, and that was kind of the goal with these bikes from the beginning, was winning races takes heart and dedication, and you just don't want the bike to hold you back. Give you a tool that can allow you to do your best. The philosophy for the design of this bike came from a downhiller's perspective. So it's a true appreciation for the bike pointed downhill and the ride quality of all the descents that you're encountering. There wasn't as much consideration for climbing. Of course, you want the climbing quality to be as good as it can without compromising any of the descending. So I have about 5 days on the bike myself. I had Charlie Harrison out to ride it last week with me. He got to rip it for 3 days. Asa raced at the BME last weekend in Colorado and won the race, and then won the race here at National Champs this weekend. Our feedback so far is that the thing rides really well from a suspension perspective. The linkage has a lot of that downhill DNA in it, and you can feel that when you're riding it. It is a smaller bike, but you can feel its intended purpose. My main complaint was the weight. If we could make the same bike lighter, that would be awesome. And I think there's some low-hanging fruit with the ability to use a carbon chainstay. That should save about 400 grams. We can go to an 065 tube on the top tube and down tube, which will save about 200 grams. And I think we can also clean up some of the gussets and maybe make them a little bit more minimal, specific for a trail bike. The head tube can go to a tapered head tube, and that'll probably save around 2 pounds off the frame, which will put it in a good spot. Could definitely do a lighter job on the build. Pretty much just took all the downhill parts we had laying around and put it on it. But I think that also attributes to how it rides. There's a couple small construction things I'd like to do a little better. The angle that the dropper post cable goes into the frame is a little bit sharp. The way that the CNC'd part around the bottom bracket is pretty sharp inside the frame, as well as a sharp curve. So it kind of scratches your outer cable, which I think we can improve on, just the way the cable goes into the frame. Where the shock extender goes into the main frame, it's a little bit tight. So I think we can improve the tolerance on that. Just a lot of little things with construction. This is the first time with this process that we're learning. It's really good. It's a whole lot better than my first downhill bike, but it could still be a little bit better. So I think another shot at the Enduro bike, maybe the V2, some small refinements, keep the ride quality the same, improve the construction, make it a little lighter, and we'll be in a pretty good spot. Thanks to Kogel for supporting the videos, and thanks to Worldwide for supporting my whole program since the beginning.